Wir werden Deutschland verändern. Ob du willst oder nicht. Sollst du dein Abo bei Hollywood? Hör auf, in diesen Planet der Affenscheiße reinzuziehen, tagtäglich.
Weil die einzige Wahrheit, die ihr kennt, die ist, die aus dieser Röhre kommt. Heute existiert schon eine ganze Generation von Menschen, die nie etwas kennengelernt hat, was nicht aus dieser Röhre gekommen ist.
Als kleine Auffrischung, ja? Bitte.
Wir sollten aufhören, unseren Mainstream-Medien zu glauben.
It was truly a historic moment, imbued with symbolism. The edifice of the man responsible for 2 decades of tyranny pulled down in the center of Baghdad. Iraqis tried to topple the statue themselves, but U.S. Marines quickly lent them a hand. There was joy and anger today.
That's the official story. The American Army helps liberated Iraqis bring down the symbol of a hated regime. But it wasn't quite so simple. An Army report revealed by the Los Angeles Times credits a psychological operations unit with stage managing the event to promote the idea of a war of liberation. The story goes like this. Entering the empty square with combat troops, the unit had an inspiration. Toppling the statue would create the defining image of the war, especially if Iraqis brought it down themselves. They used loudspeakers to call out civilians and attract international journalists. A small crowd gathered in the deserted square, and the show was underway. And later, that American flag briefly draped over the face of the dictator? Was it a propaganda era, the image of an occupier, not a liberator, and so quickly taken down? Or was it their intention to film one version for domestic American consumption and a second with the Iraqi flag for an international audience? Close-up images gave the impression of a joyous, spontaneous crowd. But look closely. It's mostly soldiers and journalists. The image was false, but memorable. Scripted for television, impact by the military. And it worked.
And then there is the toppling of the Saddam statue. A new Army report, more or less sneaked out over the weekend, concluding that the history we thought we saw in the making was actually made by a Marine colonel. That it was not entirely a grassroots effort was painfully obvious to anyone who witnessed live the actual event, the fruitless attempts to take it down, first by sledgehammer, then by rope. And as we noted here on Countdown, on that day it was ultimately American Marines who hoisted a chain around Saddam's statue's neck and then pulled it to the ground. But what we did not know is that the toppling of the statue was staged by an Army psychological operations team. As Marines converged on Firdos Square in central Baghdad, a Psy-Ops colonel identified the statue as a, quote, target of opportunity. And as one member of the team told Army investigators, testified to them, the colonel, quote, decided that the statue must come down. The Psy-Ops team then reportedly used loudspeakers to get Iraqis into the process, even placing Iraqi kids on the Marine vehicle that had been brought in to pull the statue down. But the props used on that day may not have been limited to sledgehammers and kids. In a new documentary about the war called Control Room, a producer from the network Al Jazeera claims that the civilians we see stomping on Saddam's head and cheering their liberation were not even Iraqis, then anyone familiar with the various accents of the Middle East could tell you they were not Iraqis. So what actually happened in Firdos Square on April 9th, 2003, and what actually happened the same day in newsrooms and homes around this country? The pulling down of the statue may not have been premeditated Psy-Ops, or not very premeditated, more of an opportunity seized. But here's the question. Who were these Psy-Ops guys trying to influence? Iraqis or Americans or both?
Both.
So pulling down the statue, in your opinion, actually impacted the battle for Baghdad, or the lack of a battle for Baghdad?
Oh, yeah. Well, most of the things we did once we reached the outskirts of Baghdad were to intimidate the Iraqis who still had guns and could still resist into not resisting, because everybody was talking about bloody street fighting if we went into Baghdad, and the psychological warfare people knew that their job would be more important because we didn't have enough guns to take on every armed Iraqi, but we might have enough good ideas, and taking down the statue was one of them, because basically it showed the Arab world, as well as, you know, most Iraqis, that Saddam was really gone. You got to remember that Saddam had terrorized the Iraqis for 30 years, and the psychological warfare people knew from what they had seen in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism that this leaves a population traumatized and not quite sure that they are free or that the tyrant is gone. And we've seen examples of that in the last year. So symbols are extremely important.
So in reviewing this, we're still at the point where, boom, the guys see the crowd, they see the statue, they put two and two together and do a great job of arranging this, and down the statue comes. I don't think anybody, pro-war, anti-war, or maybe anti-war, but certainly anybody on the left or the right has a real objection to that gesture to this point. But afterwards, when reporters ask questions about, was that an American flag over his face, who did the pulling, the American soldiers or the Iraqi civilians, who did this, the military came down on them, on us, like that statue falling. I mean, I asked those questions. I have my patriotism and my loyalty question, and I'd like to know where it's written that as part of Psy-Ops, it's okay to try to also strong-arm a free press in this country and dress up a lie in a flag and try to shove it down the throats of the citizens. What part of Psy-Ops is that? Does it call for at some point in the safe future, whether that's 6 months or a year later, saying to the American people, we had more of a hand in this than we admitted to at the time?
That's exactly what they did.
عملية إنزال التمثال إنه يضع العلم الأمريكي الآن على وجه التمثال، على وجه الرئيس العراقي. نعم. هذه هي رمزية ما يحدث الآن في العراق. كل شيء سيصبح بوجه أمريكي. هذه النجوم البيضاء على الشريحة الزرقاء، هذه الخطوط الحمراء والبيضاء، هذا الرمز الأمريكي سيصبح الآن عنوانا لكل ما هو آت في العراق في المستقبل القريب. هذا العلم الذي ترونه هو عنوان المرحلة. قلنا أن كل ما يجري سيكون بنكهة أمريكية وطعم أمريكي ورائحة أمريكية وهواء أمريكي. هذا العلم الآن يجسد ما يجري في العراق. الناس في الأسفل تهتف مسرورة بما يجري. هذا هو مختصر هذه الحرب. ثمة رمز وطني يستبدل برمز آخر، لا ندري أيهما سيكون خيرا من الآخر. العلم الأمريكي لا أدري لماذا خلع، هل هو لمحاولة تثبيته بطريقة أخرى أم لا؟ المتطوعون ومحبو السلام من كافة أرجاء العالم لوقف هذه الحرب فجأة يدخلون وفجأة يعتاد الناس عليهم ولا يثورون إلا فضول صحفي هنا وصحفي هناك. أما الحدث الأكبر الذي يشغل الناس في هذه المنطقة من بغداد الآن فهو كيفية إسقاط هذا التمثال للرئيس العراقي صدام حسين. ثمة 3 من المارينز يفعلون شيئا ما لإحكام وثاق ما على رقبة التمثال في محاولة لإسقاطه. عندما عجز المواطنون العراقيون قبل ساعة من الزمن انتقلوا إلى صورة للرئيس العراقي على مدخل فندق فلسطين فأحرقوها ولم تحترق بالكامل. الجندي الأمريكي أظنه تناول العلم العراقي وأظنه يحمله بيده وأظنه سيضعه على وجه الرئيس العراقي. الهتاف الآن يعلو، إنه يضع العلم العراقي، يحاول وضع العلم العراقي على وجه، الآن يضعه على رقبة وصدر الرئيس العراقي صدام حسين. يبدو أنه الآن مرتاح لإحكام الوثاق حول رقبة التمثال، لأني أراه ينزل من على التمثال. الجماهير حول التمثال تهتف بشيء ما لا أستطيع تمييزه تماما، ولكن ثمة هتاف ما يجري ولا أظنه تأييدا للرئيس العراقي ولا أظنه احتجاجا على ما يجري. ثمة هتاف ما، لكن الكثيرون خلعوا ملابسهم ويلوحون بها بأيديهم. الآن نستطيع أن نقول أن هناك فرحة أكبر مما كانت قبل قليل، على الأقل هذه الرمزية للعلم العراقي تدخل بعض الطمأنينة. بعض الأمريكان يشيرون إلى الجماهير بشيء لا أدري ما الذي يريدونه، هل يقصدون الابتعاد أم هو يتحدث مع أمريكي آخر لا أراه لا أدري. إنه يستخدم لغة الإشارة لأنه لن يسمعه أحد ضمن هذا الهتاف وهذا الهدير من الهتاف لما يجري. مكبرات الصوت تنطلق مرة أخرى. ثمة شيء ما يحدث. الأمريكي الآن أنزل العلم العراقي بمزيد من الهتاف، ينزل العلم العراقي ووضعه على كتفه وهو يريد النزول. مكبرات الصوت